It's The Log. I'm Charles Purcell. It's our Friday show, so we're going out to all the platforms. Just a reminder, if you're a subscriber, a regular weekly listener, remember we are a daily show now. We have been since the quarantine began. So if you want to hear the Monday through Thursday shows, just go to charlespurcell.com or to riverwestradio.com and look for The Log. You'll find all the shows. Well, I'll do my best today to muddle through this. As is often the case, I feel inadequately prepared for such weighty issues. And now, of course, as we've had 3 consecutive nights of violence in Minneapolis. Peaceful protests, yes, of course, but also, as you all well know by now, fires, destruction. Don't like the word riot, but there it is. So I guess if I'm going to be of any service to you today, I just want to invite us to think about things in a few ways we maybe haven't considered. I'm not going to pretend to have answers. Not going to shout my opinions today. Let's start with a little recap here. Here's the latest I'm finding here from KIRO Channel 7 in Minneapolis. Multiple fires and violent encounters erupted across Minneapolis, Minnesota, and several other major U.S. cities late Thursday after the death of George Floyd, while in police custody, sparked the 3rd consecutive night of nationwide protests. Minnesota Attorney General says he expects charges against officers soon. News coming out this morning, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison told CNN on Friday morning that he anticipates charges will soon be filed against the 4 Minneapolis police officers. Everybody believes that this is a violation of Mr. Floyd, and I believe that everybody wants to see these charges filed as soon as they can be, he said. But again, I do want to say we have seen cases that seem so clear go south. Yeah. And I'm not going to condone the violence today, the eruptions. I'm not going to condemn it either. I will say that the swift action from the FBI, from the Justice Department, from local officials, certainly hastened by the riots. I don't think there's any way we can deny that. Minneapolis police, protesters clash in pre-dawn confrontations. Police in Minneapolis clashed with protesters early Friday morning following the 3rd consecutive night of demonstrations challenging police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's death. Yeah, it's one thing to protest and have protests evolve into violence on any other kind of issue, but when it's about the police themselves, and then those very police in their military gear are charged with the mission of containing that violence, when they're the subject of the protest in the first place, that certainly adds fuel to the fire. According to CNN, the officers, some in riot gear, used pepper spray and batons to disperse crowds nearest the police station upon arrival. Yeah, a police station went up in flames. Of course, the whole Trump Twitter thing is usually just a joke, but it took a pretty ugly turn last night in the wee hours of the morning. In a series of early morning tweets, U.S. President Donald Trump criticized protesters in Minneapolis, calling them thugs and promising Minnesota Governor Tim Walz the weight of the military if needed. Here's the tweet. I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis. A total lack of leadership. Either the very weak, radical left mayor, Jacob Fry, get his act together and bring the city under control, or I will send in the National Guard and get the job done right. So in his petty, narcissistic, and completely inappropriate style, he has to bring politics into it. Radical left mayor. He continues, these thugs. Thugs? Really? Orange Menace, you're going to call them thugs? You're going to hurl a racial epithet into the middle of all this. There's a term that brands you pretty quickly if you're using the word thug to describe people of color. It pretty much labels who you are. These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when the looting starts, the shooting starts. So here's where we turn the page from petty, annoying Twitter stories to something pretty serious. And of course, we've all seen this week his little battle he's having with Twitter. Just announced yesterday, actually signed this presidential executive order threatening to control how social media works. Of course, it's toothless and nothing's going to come of it. But here's the thing. Reading now from The Guardian, Sarah Marsh reporting. Trump's message can now be read only after clicking on a notice, which says, quote, "This tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible." In a thread, Twitter said it had taken the action, quote, "in the interest of preventing others from being inspired to commit violent acts," unquote. Twitter's action came just hours after Trump said he would introduce legislation that may scrap or weaken a law that has protected internet companies, including Twitter and Facebook, in an extraordinary attempt to regulate social media platforms where he has been criticized. So that will inflame that little story, but again, trivial compared to what's really going on, but kind of an important moment as well. Let's see, continuing with the summary here. Minneapolis authorities urge caution among residents near riot scenes. Late last night, a police spokesman told NPR all personnel at the overrun 3rd Precinct are safe, but city leaders warned residents near the blaze to maintain distance following unconfirmed reports of a possible explosion. Yep, protesters overran the Minneapolis Police Department 3rd Precinct on night 3 of the protests. I'm sure you've seen the pictures by now, the video. Live stream video showed the protesters entering the building where fire alarms blared and sprinklers ran as blazes were set. Police appeared to have left the building located in the neighborhood not far from where Floyd died Monday. And as mentioned, spread across the nation. Los Angeles, Denver, I think I saw, and some very serious action in Louisville, Kentucky. Outcry over the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. That was the police shooting that happened a few weeks ago. Reached a boiling point overnight Thursday in Louisville, Kentucky, when gunfire erupted during protests and audio was released of Taylor's boyfriend's call to 911 the day of her death. 7 people were shot downtown, the mayor said in a video message on Twitter. Property damage also was reported after peaceful demonstrations took a turn, Louisville Metro Police Department officials said during a news conference. The protests turned violent as fury in Minneapolis over the death this week of an unarmed black man in police custody also took a dangerous turn, with marchers setting a police precinct on fire. Understandably, emotions are high, said Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher on Facebook, as Breonna's mother says, "Let's be peaceful as we work toward truth and justice." That is typical. We've also heard this from Floyd's family. The families are the first to speak out and ask for peace. Certainly an appropriate sentiment. I'm not going to tell anybody how to think about this today. My little white guy behind the microphone opinion isn't worth a damn right now. Again, if I can be of any service at all today, it's just going to invite us to think about these things before we just mouth off with our knee-jerk reactions. One of my social media friends writes this: working-class people pilfering convenience store goods is deemed looting. By contrast, rich folk and corporations stealing billions of dollars during their class war is considered good and necessary public policy, aided and abetted by arsonist politicians in Washington, lighting the crime scene on fire to try to cover everything up. All right, so let's think about this. Looting, fires. I'll tell you, I had absolutely no sorrow, sympathy for a Target store going up in flames. That didn't move me in any way. I could give a damn about Target. Yeah, there have been several of these comparisons I've seen in the news and social media. Looting on a grand international scale by global corporate elites. It's just standard business. It's the currency of global capitalism, to loot. So I believe in nonviolence. Of course I do. I practice it myself, but I'm not going to condemn these people. Times like this, I turn to Martin Luther King. We've heard the quote, at least I hope we have by now. A riot is the language of the unheard. Let me read the whole quote to you. Martin Luther King. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so, in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. So there's from the man himself. Sure, easy to condemn riots, but do we condemn ongoing conditions of inequality and oppression as vigorously? Do we even recognize those conditions? A riot is the language of the unheard. When people have just had enough. And again, yeah, my heart doesn't go out to the 3rd Precinct Minneapolis Police Station. My heart doesn't go out to an auto zone that gets torched or a Target store that gets looted. I really don't give a damn. I've been crying my entire adult life for these institutions to be destroyed, quite literally destroyed. Now, what I advocate for, and have been for decades, is that we destroy them through policy, through reform. The police, as we know them, the structure, the system, has to be burned to the ground, metaphorically. Through policy and reform, just burned to the ground. But it hasn't happened. We've known for years there's a straight pipeline from the KKK right through to the police. We've known for years, researchers have told us. They've shown us the numbers. The astronomical level of racism embedded in U.S. police forces. We know it. We know the facts. I know. Your brother's a cop, or you know a cop, or your friend is a cop and he's a good guy. Sure, of course. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about one single person. I'm talking about an entire system that is rotten to its core. One of the first arguments you hear from knee-jerk reactions from both black and white voices, and again, just to be clear, I'm going to be very careful. I'm going to check myself today. I will not judge people whose lived experience is different than mine, especially people of color. I'm just a white guy behind a microphone. But you'll hear people in the community, people of color, saying, stop doing this. We're hurting our own neighborhood. Just reading a story yesterday that quoted someone in that vein. And then quoted another person who was engaging in the violence and said something to the effect, yeah, it's our neighborhood, but we don't own it. We just work in these stores as wage slaves if we're lucky enough to have a job at all. We don't own this Target. It's a big white corporation. But then that same argument about, oh, you're just hurting your own neighborhood, when that comes from white commentators, people just living a real comfortable life. Those comments are just full of dog whistles, full of status quo thinking. Martin Luther King said over 50 years ago that America has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. America has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. Well, how can we even pretend to think we're any better in 2020 when just in the last few weeks, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and now in the most heinous, visible display, George Floyd. You think this reaction is just for one or two incidents? No, of course not. Weeks, months, years, decades since the founding of this damn country. Genocide and slavery and racial exploitation, oppression, that still to this day has not been addressed. Because it's so fundamental, a lot of us don't even see it. It's so embedded, it's so ingrained into our national identity. Are we as white folks still guilty, as Martin Luther King charged over 50 years ago, still guilty of being more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity? Riots don't come out of nowhere. Violence doesn't come out of nowhere. And the only way to prevent them going forward is to get serious about social justice and progress. Martin Luther King is the most celebrated advocate for nonviolence in history. Martin Luther King and Gandhi stand side by side on that Mount Rushmore of nonviolence. But he understood. Martin Luther King understood. You can't commodify every single aspect of living and then not understand looting as a legitimate form of protest. This is a little post I saw yesterday from the Hampton Institute. Looting is the ultimate strike against a system that deems mass-produced objects to be far more precious than life itself. It is humanity demanding to be recognized. You think that sounds extreme? Not at all. Commodify every single aspect of living. Not an exaggeration. Every waking moment is dictated by the prices they put on our freedom, on the necessities of life, healthcare, education, whether or not you're going to have kids, where you can live. Money's at the heart of all of it. Commodification of every single aspect of living. So what is looting if not a protest? That hits the exact right note. Looting is the ultimate strike against a system that deems mass-produced objects to be far more precious than life itself. You're also going to hear, well, two wrongs don't make a right. Yeah, you're going to make that equivalence? You're going to equate a human life snuffed out violently over 8 minutes with a looted television set? It is humanity demanding to be recognized. It's been said that war is a failure of policy. Can't get things done diplomatically. Whatever system of government you've got going isn't working for great numbers of people. War is always a result of failure. And that's what a riot is. Looting, vandalism, fires. Just the clearest signal yet that well-intentioned, privileged, comfortable white folks like me have failed in convincing us to reform. There should be no such thing as a police force the way we currently know it. Weaponized, militarized, racist, much more focused on protecting capital. And of course, we all know that capital is owned by a tiny sliver, 1%, as Bernie likes to remind us. Only 1% of us own the capital. And the police are there to protect that. So that means they're working for the 1%, and all the rest of us be damned. To the extent they do protect and serve, if I'm in danger of somebody hurting me, yeah, sometimes they can intervene. But we don't need this entire blue system to do that. Now, this goes way over my pay grade. I'll just toss it out as something to think about, and you can look into it. I'm sure minds much better than mine have come up with alternative systems. I'm sure they're out there. But just to toss it out, all right, let's dismantle the cops completely, so they don't even exist in a manner we recognize them right now. What do we replace them with? Well, I'll say it has to be community-based. Each community, each local community has to police itself, protect and serve those others in your community. The obscene weaponization of police forces only invites violence, creates more violence and death. In a community-based entity, actually built and designed to protect and serve those who live in the community, weapons would be unnecessary 99.9% of the time and would be locked up most of the time. If and when there is an armed, violent danger to the community, I call myself a 99% pacifist. Well, there's my 1%. If it becomes necessary to save lives, it's an extraordinary circumstance, there's where I let my 1% fly. But other than that, no. So I've wanted to, quote unquote, burn police stations to the ground. But I have failed, and any like-minded people have failed. And so what happens as the result of failure? Well, last night, a few people in Minneapolis literally burned a precinct to the ground. If you know me at all, if you know this show, you know that I have no patience, no sympathy, no empathy at all for capitalism, for a money-centric society that commodifies everything. I've wanted to burn targets to the ground. I want them to not exist anymore. There are thousands of alternatives to our current system. There are many ways we can organize society to create and distribute necessary goods, where all people are honored within that system. Well, my little radio rants and others, much more qualified, committed activists, theorists, have offered countless alternatives to the current system where 1% of us operate target stores. So, yeah, we've wanted to burn things to the ground. We've wanted to fundamentally destroy in order to build something better and more just. But up to this point, we have failed. I have failed. Great thinkers and theorists capable of things far beyond my capabilities have failed. And then that hot bed of embers that have burned on a low level ever since Europeans set foot on this continent, sometimes flaring into great blazes, great destructive fires of Native American genocide, of black African slavery. And even during the best of times, even if those flames subside, the embers are always ready to spark. And we're conditioned to think that everything's fine. Systems of injustice and exploitation and oppression and racism are normalized, allowing them to grow, to flourish, giving those embers oxygen until something sparks them off again. And now the latest spark in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with the brutal, intentional murder of George Floyd. And we're going to sit in judgment today of those who react, of those who have no voice. They are unheard, and these riots are their language, as Martin Luther King put it. I will never condone violence. Is torching a building violence? Is spray painting a cop car violence? Is looting a Target store violence? I'm going to leave you to think about that. I would advise you not to answer too quickly, because I think we'd all agree that what happened to Freddie Gray at the hands of 6 Baltimore police officers was violence. What happened to Sam Dubose, an unarmed black motorist, during a 2015 traffic stop, was violence. What happened to Philando Castile, shot in his car, captured live on Facebook? I think we'd all agree that was violence. What happened to Terrence Crutcher in Oklahoma, shot with his hands in the air, unarmed? That was violence. I think we'd agree what happened to Alton Sterling was violence. Shot to death as officers pinned him to the pavement for selling CDs. I think we'd agree that what happened to Jamar Clark was violence. Jeremy McDowell, William Chapman, Walter Scott, Eric Harris, unarmed, restrained, and shot. I think we'd agree that what happened to Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy, fatally shot by a white Cleveland police officer in a recreational area because he was playing with a toy gun and was reported as a man waving a gun. I think we'd agree that was violence. Michael Brown, violence. Eric Garner, I Can't Breathe, violence. I think we would all agree what happened to Emmett Till was violence. So let's not equate graffiti and looting and even fires with this level of violence. Because I think we'd all agree that what happened to Breonna Taylor was violence. What happened to Ahmaud Arbery was violence. And what happened to George Floyd was violence. This episode of The Log is available right now wherever you find your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, iHeart, YouTube, and the podcast source. Enter Charles Burcell Presents in the search window. Or best yet, go to charlesburcell.com. There you'll find this and all the other series in the podcast family. Follow, comment, and contact me on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks to our flagship terrestrial station, River West Radio, riverwestradio.com. Theme music composed and performed by Peter Donalds. From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Burcell.